I've been thinking recently about tropes. Specifically, I've been thinking about like book tropes and like queering book tropes. This is like taking a conventional trope and then making it gay somehow, you know? I feel like I don't need to explain the difference between like tropes and cliches. You're on the internet, just do your own research, I guess. And I've been wondering why queering tropes can be so satisfying from a writing standpoint, but then also from a reader's perspective. You know, like why is Felix Ever After a friends to lovers book? Why did Sophie Gonzalez write Only Mostly Devastated as a Grease retelling? What is so compelling about Polly disguising herself as a man, specifically in Monstrous Regiment? And while we're on Terry Pratchett, why is the queer-coded way that he writes gender in Dwarves so interesting? Why is the enemies to lovers in This Is How You Lose the Time War so powerful? And likewise for the found family in The Disasters and Spellhacker by M.K. England. All these questions, just a big question mark. You know, why? What's going on here? What's going on? There's this big, like, rhetoric about how there's no more originality and everything is just a product of what has come before, whether it's a love letter to that thing, or it's paying homage to that thing, or it's like taking inspiration from that thing, or it's doing what it does to spite this other thing that's come before it, you know? Does that make sense? The idea is that everything in culture comes from something else. And this is an idea that extends back to like our first stories as beings on this planet. We could say the same thing for like tropes though, right? Like story elements. This is kind of obvious now that I'm saying it out loud. I'm just gonna keep going. Surely like every new coffee shop AU, we have to share one bed, chosen one, Dark Lord, fantasy mentor just comes from the last one, right? Like tropes in this sense are becoming, or maybe have always been, the vernacular through which we understand stories. Like people make lists of their favorite tropes and they'll seek out books with those tropes. When we recommend books, literally I just did it just then. When I like was talking about books, I was talking about the tropes that were in those books. And you know, whether or not people are attracted to those tropes, we've created this language, especially on like booktube and fandom spaces. I don't know, I just think it's interesting. I'm not saying this is a new thing, but I think there's something comforting about the formula and familiarity of the tropes that we like. I'm also not saying this is my idea. I think it just is, you know? I think this is a big reason why queering tropes is so satisfying and interesting, at least to me, is because it's comforting. We're writing ourselves and our experiences that can be so turbulent and feel so detached from the rest of reality into a vernacular that's familiar and that we feel safe in. I'd imagine that it's the same for most marginalized communities. I think it's interesting about when a queer author will write their experiences into a trope is that there are so many different places that they could be coming from, you know? Like, what might a fantasy prophecy look like if the chosen one is overlooked as a child because they didn't align with the gender, the language of the prophecy, and the child just like hadn't realized they were transgender yet and actually do fit the prophecy? And then you get this whole story about like, oh, they have to like go and like fight this prophecy, but do they actually have to? Because that's like this whole thing. It's this whole thing. I think that's so interesting. You know, what might a slow burn romance look like if we look at it through the lens of queer temporality? You know, where does that start and end? At what point do you, how far are we gonna take our queer royals AU before our characters realize that the idea of royalty, an inherent title, is like an inherently heteronormative concept, and that at some point, these queer royals will probably be engaging in some point of like homonormative nationalism? How does your queer male fantasy protagonist react to the inevitable death of his mentor, when his mentor was probably also part of his like sexual awakening? How might we look at the mask of power trope? That's a TV tropes thing, I'll put it up there. In a story where it's used as a metaphor for being in the closet. It would be so interesting to look at literally any romance tropes with an A-spec or arrow spectrum character involved. I think that's so interesting. This video isn't like, I guess it doesn't have much of a point. I think I just sort of wanted to like open up a discussion for queer readers and writers around tropes and why we use them and how we use them and stuff like that. Because I think while there is value in just making it gay, just cause, I think there's a lot more to be found if we look at tropes with like a critical eye. Specifically in genre fiction, I think there's so much to be like mined there that hasn't been yet. I just think that's so interesting. Let me know your thoughts. Do you have a favorite trope? Is there a favorite instance in which a trope has been queered in a way that was meaningful to you? Yeah, and if you made it this far in the video, leave me a book emoji, because books.